Okay. Welcome to everyone to the PMI webinar, Facilitating Effective Meetings, Planning, Status, and Lesson Learned. My name is Matteo, and I introduce this webinar organized by PMI Northern Italian chapter. Before beginning, I will explain some basic rules and information. First of all, I remember that this webinar is totally in English, and if everyone has some problem to listen heard, I suggest to exit and come back to the webinar. For this webinar, PMI will provide one PDU in strategy. The PDU will be approved in some days, so don't worry if you don't see it immediately if available. You all have the chance to make questions, but not directly to the presenters. So you can write the question in the chat window, and then I will choose which questions asked to the authors. I will choose the questions in order to be not repetitive and in order to respect scheduling. You can write the questions in Italian language, and I will translate for you. After the webinar, you will receive automatically in your email a survey. So we kindly ask to answer to the survey. Now I introduce you the two authors of the presentation, Rich Maltzman and Jim Stewart. Rich Maltzman is recently retired from a 40-year veteran of the telecom industry with the last 30 years in global PMO role. He's currently a senior lecturer at Boston University, where he develops and teaches classes in project management and in qualitative and quantitative decision making. Rich is the co-founder of the Earth PM, a company devoted to integrating sustainability thinking into project management. The other one is Jim Stewart. Since 2003, he is a principal of GAP Stewart Associates, has been engaged in multiple endeavors, including consulting, training and mentoring. He is PMP member since 2001 and certified Scrum Master since 2013. He actually provides PMP preparation training, both in public and private in-house sessions. In consulting, he frequently contributes by helping organizations increase their project maturity. He recently consulted to a financial services firm to help them to set up a project management office and receive his IC Agile coaching certificate. Jim is also on the PM advisory board of a training organization called MindEdge, and he will be providing one day into the Agile workshop, a project summit business analyst board in the fall. Both are co-authors of the book, How to Facilitate Productive Project Planning Meetings, from which arises this webinar. This session will assist you in your projects by providing valuable tips and ideas. And we, as a PMI North Italian chapter, choose this to organize this webinar because nowadays the projects you lead from your company are often multifunctional and engage a wide variety of stakeholders. And rigorous planning is vital to your organization's ability to oversee project execution and success. But project planning often tends to be done piecemeal or not at all, many times leading to missing and or incomplete information and corresponding poor results. Effective planning meetings will help you not only develop and use key artifacts, they will also strengthen and motivate your team. As a project or project manager, you can help drive effectiveness of all your projects if your meetings are well run, to the point, yield clear direction, and are results oriented. Using the concept of large multi-day planning meeting, we'll discuss how to set up and facilitate such a meeting both in person and in virtual environments. Since those same techniques also apply to smaller meetings, we'll also discuss status and lesson learned meetings. In the webinar, we'll also briefly discuss Agile and the similarity of scale Agile to more traditional planning sessions. So I give immediately the floor to the presenter to start the presentation. First of all, to Jim. Okay. Jim, you can start.
Okay, thank you, Matteo. Jim Stewart here. Welcome, everyone. I'm here with my colleague, Rich Maltzman.
Hello.
And want to say hi, Rich, to the group.
And hello.
That's
Continue.
Rich. And we are going to sort of take turns presenting. We find it not only do we share a similar background, but we also have different experiences that bring a different flavor or emotion to the discussion. So we'll go back and forth. And I think what Matteo said was you're seeing a goblin there if you're seeing the screen. We'll explain that later. You can thank Rich for that because we'll talk about that later. Um, the basic idea behind this was we were thinking about big planning meetings. You all know as project managers, maybe some of you aren't project managers. I bet the majority of you are. And you know that you have to plan for your projects. Now, these are traditional waterfall, traditional project management. We talk some about agile, but this is these planning. You have to create risk registers and schedules and work breakdown structures. So what Rich and I have discovered over the years, and both of us, we have many years of project management, that instead of planning over a long period of time, it's advantageous to do a lot of upfront planning, get it over with quickly in a 2 or 3 day session. So this grew out of that. We're sort of going to speak to you on several levels. That level, and then from there, what is the best etiquette or best practices if you're just running a status meeting or a lessons learned meeting. So think of it on several levels, and maybe we'll convince you that where you can start thinking about whether you should have one of those big planning meetings. So I wanted to set that stage so you're not confused about what we're presenting. Now, here are the key learning points. Understand why planning is so important. Both Rich and I teach PMP and have for years certification. And I think there's, correct me if I'm wrong, Rich, here, 24 or 25 planning processes in the PMBOK. I forget the exact number now, but it's
24 out of 49.
out of 49. So planning is highly important because if you don't plan before, you're going to plan during. So you understand the importance of planning. Secondly, how to prepare for and facilitate these large project planning meetings, even if they're not large. How to facilitate being the key word here. We'll talk about what that is and what it isn't, and the impacts of culture on team dynamics. You know, the various cultures we work with. I work every day with. I work from the Boston area. Rich and I are about 20 kilometers north of Boston, and we both work with different cultures, and so it's important to understand how that impacts you and your team. Now, what is it based on? I kind of talked about that. Large project team meetings, presenters are facilitated both domestically and internationally. I've done work internationally. Rich has lived internationally. He lived over in the Netherlands for a few years, so we both had that exposure. We talk about the less momentous, if no less important, lessons learned and status meetings. We have a book about this. It's based on our own and others' war stories, what we call dispatches from the field. Other people that have shared stories with us that where meetings didn't go quite so well. And again, the assumption is a waterfall project kickoff. We'll briefly touch upon Agile, and you'll see why at the end. See why we do that. Although it's not an Agile introduction by any means. Now, do we need planning? Well, actually, we said this already too. Almost half of the processes in the PMBOK, whether they're create work breakdown structure, develop schedule, develop budget, or in planning. We spend a significant amount of time discussing planning. That doesn't mean the PMBOK says you must plan for a month. PMI basically says plan heavily and then execute to that plan. What's the message? Fail to plan, plan to fail. You can insert your own cliche, and we have that picture, as the carpenters say, at least they say here, measure twice, cut once, but look, they've cut off the E in twice. So you get the idea of the importance of it. And one more piece of information about that. These numbers you're looking at about the failure of projects, I find so distressing because Rich and I have talked about this for several years. They never seem to change. It just seems like the surveys always show that there are X number of projects that fail, whether it's 30% or 25% or 40%. It seems to be almost a belief that that's the way it has to be. Rich and I don't believe that at all. We don't know that it will ever go to zero, but we believe it can be less than 25 or 30% because people aren't approaching the projects correctly, we believe. And we're talking about one person I presented to laughed. You're planning for a meeting? Well, yes. you're going to plan somewhat for your regular status meeting, but probably not a lot if that's your regular thing. Certainly for a lessons learned. And if you're having a big meeting to bring people together, we're talking about stakeholders, possibly from around the world, to a location. I've done these in France, I've done them in Chicago, Rich has done them a variety of places. You're going to be bringing people in from all over. You have to plan this meeting, because if you're going to have a big planning meeting, and the only way that people know you is through that planning meeting, and you can't run that meeting or facilitate it, you're going to question how well you can run the project. So that's the basis of what we're talking about. And I'll turn this over to Rich for a little while.
Thank you, Jim.
Yep.
What you're looking at here is a project that didn't work out so well, and it's failed in the execution phase. And one of the things we're trying to convince you of is that planning for a project includes the same kind of planning you'd put into the bridge planning for the meeting, so that you would avoid this kind of mismatch. Now, this is obviously an exaggeration, I hope, but the idea is that we avoid these kinds of issues, because right up front in that planning meeting, everyone would be very clear about where the bridge is being built and where it's expected to meet in the middle across the body of water that it's crossing. So if you don't plan, we all know this, if you don't plan a project, if you leave out even a few of those 24 planning processes that PMI has out of 49, so almost half, you're going to have problems. As illustrated by the picture, I won't read all the words, but I'll focus on the human element here. You see the person in the center there holding his hands to his head. He can't believe what he's seeing. As a project is moving forward, if the project isn't planned well, it actually is a spiraling situation, because the frustration and morale issues you have in planning will actually yield more planning communications and perhaps even contention issues amongst the team members. So there's increased risk, and of course, risk can be both opportunity and threat. And as you see from the picture, mainly here, it's threat if you don't do planning. The bottom line here, planning isn't avoidable. You're going to do it. The question is it going to be the kind of last minute planning where you use duct tape and super glue and rope to fix things? Or is it the kind of upfront planning that would avoid the use of all of those last minute things? Next slide, please. So here, a lot of words in the slide. I want you to just step back for a moment and think of your attendees from their perspective. What makes you want to go to a meeting? So put your regular employee or consultant hat on and say you're being called to a meeting. What makes you want to go? And then turn that back in your planning for your meeting. The things that make people want to come to the meeting is they want a chance to contribute. They want to get their points across. They have some creative ideas and they want to express them. I love the third from the bottom. It actually comes from the play Hamilton. You know you want to be in the room where it happens. You know that this is an important meeting and you want to be part of it. So your calling people to a meeting should take this into account, and the invitation shouldn't just say project planning meeting next Tuesday. It's going to have some of these elements to draw people in. These kinds of enticements, other than just the logistics of the time and place. You want a chance to express yourself, make sure you or a representative, a delegate, an authorized delegate is an empowered delegate is at the meeting. So that's the meaningfulness of this slide. Next one, please.
One comment here, Rich, before we move on. I used to work at a software company, and there was a software manager who hated to go to meetings. He would come to me and say, what is the business reason for this meeting? And it was a fair question, because I had to answer that question for him, because if I couldn't answer for him, I couldn't answer it for anybody. So I think we need to be able to justify our meetings.
Right. Good. Thanks, Jim. So stakeholders, we all know, we should know as PMs that stakeholder is anyone who cares about the project, either while it's taking place or after it's turned on and its after effect, its outcome is in place. So because of that, stakeholders are really the key to planning. If we need to know, we can do everything right, but if we leave off the electrical engineering department and they're key to this, then it doesn't matter how well we plan the meeting if we're absent of their attendance. So think broadly. all kinds of stakeholders and think deeply within each field. Let's say electrical engineering. Have you considered the electricians and not just the electrical engineers? So this is the same kind of planning you're doing when you're planning the project, but now you're applying it to the planning of the meeting. So you want to include stakeholders because they can help you and they can hurt you. And we're going to talk more about stakeholders with I think a pretty creative 3D drawing coming up in just a few slides. Next one. I really like this book. Some of my Dutch friends, I did live in the Netherlands for 2 years, near Den Haag. I learned how to make my guttural sounds. And several of them, led by Menno Valkenburg, wrote this book called The 5 Frustrations of Project Managers. And in it, it's a very thin book, even though there's a lot of frustrations. They talk about energy in meetings. And if you look at a meeting that's not well prepared, you spend a little time preparing, and you'll see the energy put into preparation on the left in the gray, the low gray rectangle that says preparation. And then you end up running the meeting with some level of energy and no feedback. The preferred way is to spend some more energy and time on preparation, and then notice the meeting is shorter in time. The x-axis is time, but it's shorter and more action-packed, more efficient. So if you do the planning correctly, you end up with more meeting. This underlined what Jim and I were finding when we did our interviews with folks and the research, and reflected on our own experience. And then you do spend some time at the end on evaluation for improvements in ongoing meetings. Overall, it's about generating energy at your meetings. Interest, think of energy as interest. The book is great, and I put a little image of it here. Very short paperback book, easy to read, and you will share these 5 frustrations, and one of them is absolutely, you guessed it, meetings. Next slide, please. I'll walk you slowly, quickly through this slide. These are just some tips. Spend time preparing and evaluating prior meetings so that you make them effective in advance. You've thought about how things have gone poorly in the past, and you've taken advantage of that. Make sure that not only have you prepared for a high energy level, but that you're aware. You have to keep stepping back from your role of an attendee to a role of a facilitator. Step back, observe the energy level in the room. If it's not there, maybe it's time for a coffee break, espresso break. Figure out your own role. Are you the facilitator? Maybe you've actually hired a consultant to come in, or someone else to help you with the meeting. You need to know that, and that should be clear between you and anyone else you're sharing that facilitation role with. Start the meeting by focusing on relationships. One of the things, it's not on the slide, but one of the things you might want to do is go around the room and collect the number of years of experience in the room. Add that up and then say, hey folks, there's 3 centuries of experience in this room, because quickly that will add up. You'll find that someone had 20 years, someone has 10, someone has 13, someone has 45. You add that all up, and then just say to everyone, we should be impressed. We have, 3.5 centuries worth of experience. And then allow the topic owner to indicate, what do they expect from the meeting? What do they expect from their portion of the contribution to the meeting? Make sure that that's clear so that they're not sitting there steaming because they didn't have a chance to speak their piece. Next meeting. Next slide, please.
I'm with you.
So this is more for comedy than anything else. Use the expression when in Rome or Milan, do as the Romans or the Milanese. This just shows, thanks to Richard Lewis, from whom we got permission to use this, different cultures, starting with Germany. In a German meeting, formal introduction, sit down, begin. And I've been to several meetings in Stuttgart and Munich and Frankfurt, and they were kind of like this. They started on time, quick introductions, start the meeting, get right to business. Whereas in Southern Europe, Spain and Italy, the other extreme, a little bit of introduction, people come in a little bit late perhaps, we wait for everyone to arrive, talk about football, we talk about families, and then we get around to starting. So be aware of this, be culturally aware. one of the references we give in the book is Geert Hofstede, who's done a lot of studies of the different cultures and how they act. This is really just about, for comedy reasons, how meetings run, but in general, the way people act, the way people behave at meetings and in the project can be described pretty well from studies that have been done. So take advantage of that and don't be the, as shown in the image here, the ugly American saying howdy to a French person sitting there who's not going to appreciate that greeting. Next slide. So this is for that larger planning meeting Jim talked about, having a 2-day or even 3-day planning meeting. This is the plan for that planning meeting. Have an agenda. Make sure that your agenda is clear to you and tested on someone else. Plan for 2 full days worth of work. If you're planning even a medium-sized project, you're going to want to have 2 days in which your team can be creative. Things like identifying elements of the work breakdown structure, on which we'll discuss later. Set the expectations early and often. You'll have people coming and going, so remind them. And then keep on the lookout. This is a biggie, and it's subtle. Keep on the lookout for hidden agendas. People are coming to these meetings and they might have something that they just want to change about the project, and look for this, right? And usually you want to have a pairwise individual conversation with someone who appears to have a hidden agenda and find, hey, what is it that you're after here? Because otherwise they may hijack the meeting. And we'll talk later about these goblins. This is one of the sources of power for these meeting goblins. Next slide. So stakeholders, I promised we'd have this 3D vision of stakeholders. This comes from Dr. David Hilson, the so-called risk doctor. I've hyped up his image, which was all just gray squares. Think about the 3 axes here: attitude, power, and interest. At the top of this cube are those who are, they're in favor of the project. They want to see this happen. Those towards the back are those with high power, towards the front, low power. Those to the right are those with high interest. So let's just take a couple of examples. In the upper left, you see the Frankenstein-like icon or emoticon. This is a sleeping giant. High power, not really that interested in the project, but would tend to have a good attitude. What do you want to do with this person? You want to convince them that they should be interested, because you can convert them, if you move from the left to the right here, from sleeping giant to savior. And I won't go through all of these, but in Hilson's book, he gives a couple of paragraphs of advice about each of these meeting stakeholders, and they could also be project stakeholders, of course, and how you would perhaps move them to a better position. Or if you have someone who's a saboteur, high interest, high power, negative attitude, how you might squelch that a little bit and move them over toward time bomb or irritant. So it's a fascinating piece in the book. We like it, and we apply it to how to deal with stakeholders in your meetings. Next, I think we go back to James.
Back to me. So thanks, Rich. Preparing for the meeting continued. Now, if you're going to have this big planning meeting, hold a preliminary phone call. I can't stress enough how you have to prepare for the thing that you're going to do. Assign pre-work. If you have this, even if the planning meeting is a half a day or a day, don't let me scare you into thinking you must have a 2-day planning meeting or you will fail. It's good to have a planning meeting. Some of it can be virtual. Talk about that. But people should come prepared with work that you might give them. So for example, I did some work in pharmaceutical. Assign pre-work. The regulatory people would come and speak about the manufacturing people. So give us your point of view. Make sure your technology works. So for example, in this meeting, we had a meeting last week for 1 hour. This 1 hour meeting today, we met with the folks on the phone in Italy. We had several meetings, in fact, to use this as an example. We tested the equipment. We tested my computer, Rich's computer, the sound, even just before we came on for a 1 hour meeting. So, but make sure it works. Because what happens, especially if you're like me and you work in IT, everybody wants to fix everything during the meeting. So if something doesn't work, you have 10 people trying to fix your mouse instead of you just lost 10 minutes in your meeting. So we know how technology is. We get it, but try to have that tested. If you're having a planning meeting, try to get away from the office. A lot of what Rich and I talk about is not just based on us running meetings, but also training. We've been training collectively for years and years. And if we do an in-house training, people running out of the training room. So get people away from the office if you can. Hotels are great because they have everything you need. Expect resistance, you know what resistors are, because people will resist. Before we get to the checklist, you know, the project might involve change, and the meeting involves preparing for that change. And so people just can't be bothered with that. So expect resistance and deal with it. Why are they resisting? Why are some people resisting? Because they will. So accept that as a given. And do have a checklist. If you're going to run a meeting, facilitator and or co-facilitator. Now, facilitation is a little bit of what Rich and I are doing today, but really if you're running a day-long meeting, let's say it's a day-long meeting for sake of argument, you need somebody who can facilitate us move things along. Somebody who can move things along, someone who knows when to change the agenda, someone who can handle conflict, someone who can say that should be offline, someone who doesn't let the group take over, Rich called hijacking the meeting. Have an attendee list reviewed by your sponsor. The sponsor is your evangelist. Sponsor is the person supporting your project, perhaps paying for it. Have an agenda that's out there. You know, I won't read everything here, but it was that setting expectations. People hate surprises. When I tell my students to use, when I talk about the word expectations, now when I teach PMP, just for one example, to shift to that model for a minute, on the fourth day I give a practice exam. I consider the students my stakeholders. Two scenarios. Scenario one, they walk in on the fourth day and I surprise them with an exam. Scenario two, I tell them day one, which is better. I prepare them with expectations. You don't want to surprise your stakeholders. There's no joy in that for you or for them. Artifacts. Now you're going to be creating certain artifacts, even if it's a smaller status meeting or lessons learned meeting. Status meeting, you might be updating the risk register. You might be updating the schedule. Lessons learned, you're updating the lessons learned document or lessons learned register. But in these meetings, these upfront meetings where you're creating artifacts, we call them that, or work breakdown structure. If you're not familiar, we have a link to a WBS is. A draft schedule, a high-level risk register, a RACI, responsible, accounted, consulted, informed, for people who are responsible for items, issues. These are great things to start your project with. That's why we're sort of trying to, if not convince you or sway you, at least make an argument why having these big upfront meetings is good, because the things you're looking at, you're probably saying, boy, I wish I had those, or boy, I wish I had those before month 6. How about day 3? At least you can have high-level drafts of those things. It makes a world of difference in kickstarting your project.
And as you can see, this has been done for a long time. That's an unearthed RACI matrix from 3000 BCE.
There you go. Who knew, right? Facilitation. As I mentioned, it's more than that. He or she makes sure there's effective participation, people mutually understand. If you're going to do one of these, either get an experienced facilitator or learn facilitation, or get someone in your company that says, I know how to do that. It shouldn't be your first time, one would hope, if you have a really important meeting. Remember, if you're the project manager and the facilitator, and your meeting management skills aren't good, they're going to wonder about you running you may be the greatest project manager in history. They're going to wonder, this person can't ever run this meeting. The Zen of facilitation. Begin with the end in mind. Think about what your goals are. That's an important point, and we talk about it later. Always have the goal in mind. When someone interrupts you during the meeting and they want to digress to something else, say to yourself, how does this help me get to my goal? If it doesn't, you have to be a little cold and say, we have to put that to the side now and discuss the reason we're here. Have a timekeeper. I'm keeping time of where we are now. It's a half-hour in. Expectations, ground rules. We have, if you remember Austin Powers, it's probably a very old movie reference. Set ground rules for behavior. I have never had a meeting where I had to say to somebody, please take your phone outside and make a call. People just do that. This may be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe the one. Rich and I have done this presentation several times with some podcasts. Be large and in charge, and don't worry about being liked. You see, the problem is too many times when we're on a meeting, somewhere in our head we're thinking, boy, if I don't let Fred or Mary or whomever, using American names, that's all I'm thinking of right now, but if I don't let that person just sort of speak, they won't like me or they won't think I'm giving them the floor. You have to be able to step in and say, I'm sorry, but that's an interesting point. Let's put it aside and move on. You're not there to be liked. You're not there to be disliked, but you have to be large and be in charge. And also be a good listener and watch body language, because people will convey what we can't see here virtually. They'll convey their feelings through body language. You've got to be amenable and watch for that as well. And lastly, for me, and then we'll turn it back over to Rich, I like these people with megaphones. You'll see another one later on. Your sponsor should at least be at the beginning of the meeting. If she can be at the entire meeting, great. But if she can't because she's busy, she's probably a VP or an executive VP, she should be at the meeting to set the tone, state the purpose. Why are we here? Empower the facilitator, empower the project manager, give an overview, answer questions. You know, what happens is if I, as the project manager, come in, and I can do this, but I have that person that says, you're here because I've asked Jim or Rich or whomever to facilitate, to run this, to make sure it happens. This is why we're here. Even though we've answered the questions beforehand, re-answer them. So that's why I think it's important to have the sponsor there. The beginning, key points during it, perhaps at the end. Again, this is a large meeting. And we'll go back to Rich.
Can you leave the slide up for a sec? I just want to make a comment. If you leave that slide up for a sec, think of the charter. We all know it. We're all PMI members, or at least 95% of us are. A charter is where the project manager has been authorized to take on the project. Think of what Jim just said as an enactment, almost a one act play, where that's being physically acted out. And in his case, the sponsor, she's handing authority over to you in the presence of the meeting attendees. It's almost an enactment of the charter. It's a good way to think of it. Okay, let's continue.
Good.
So here we are with our meeting goblins. Here they are. We have Nancy, the nasty naysayer, and for example, and Charlie, the challengingly chatty, and Tina, the tangent taker. I'll stop there. Let's talk about Tina, the tangent taker. Here you are using valuable time, many people perhaps attending from all over Italy and even other countries in your kickoff meeting, and a person has started to talk about something that's mildly related but is not really productive. What do you do? In the book, we do talk about each of these personality types and specific actions you can take, and I'll take Tina as an example. It's a pretty interesting one. Let's say she's off talking about something else and you're looking at your watch and looking at the faces of others, rolling their eyes. This is not really what we're here for. You can stop. You should stop and say, Tina, can you tell us how this relates to the risk response plan we're putting together? And that might be enough to have them stop and say, well, it's actually only mildly related, and they'll correct themselves. You could say, look, you got a couple more minutes to make this point and we must move on. And sometimes the pure, plain old direct approach is necessary. And as Jim said, you can't always be everyone's friend. It's not like you're trying to be disliked, but you shouldn't put all your energy into being liked. You might have to say, Tina, we need to get back on track. Carl, and you turn to Carl. That's not a goblin, it's another meeting attendee. Carl, what ideas do you have? And that simple action of turning to another person and basically swinging the cameras, the virtual cameras of this reality show over to Carl, is forcing Tina to stop taking her tangent.
And that's large and in charge.
Being large and in charge, right? And sometimes it doesn't even require doing anything nasty. That little turning to Carl, I mean, Tina might be slightly affronted when you do that, but you're actually helping Charlie, and you're helping everyone else in the meeting who now says, thank goodness someone took charge and stopped Tina from her rant, because that's not really helping the meeting. So again, this is something that we've kind of had some fun with, but at the same time, we think there are some, and they relate to our war stories. All the war stories Jim mentioned, when we talked to dozens of other project managers about what they've seen in meetings, we kept imagining these critters, these goblins, and we gave them names and here even figures. So that's our shtick, and we're sticking with it.
Okay.
Next slide.
This is the beginning of the 2-day meeting.
Right. So in a 2-day meeting, in day one, what is it that you'll do in that first day? You obviously want to let the functional teams, that's one of the nice things about these meetings is you've got people, the heterogeneous members of all different kinds of contributing teams together for perhaps for the first and maybe the only time in the project. Have them all give a brief presentation about what's their perspective. If there's a difficult installation situation, let them talk about the risks and threats they see. Let everyone hear that. They will really appreciate that chance. You're going to want to be busy here listening. This is where, as Jim said, active listening is important, and you better have your pen out. And if you have a deputy that can record this for you, or if you're even recording the meeting, take advantage of recording this. Ideally, as Jim says in the slide, have it on a flip chart so that your notes are visible to everyone. Then you'll introduce the WBS concept, and there's a reference here, really, really nice. This is a fairly lengthy, easy to read guide to how to build a WBS. As Jim said, I teach graduate level PM classes. We'll be doing this tomorrow with pizza. That's maybe a tribute to Italy. We do a work breakdown structure exercise around dough and sauce, and the teams decompose the effort it takes to create those two elements of a pizza. It's done with sticky notes or post-it notes. There's several good techniques. We explain them in the book as to how you can build a WBS. And believe me, the participation element of this, the fact that people have their say that early in the project, is a lifesaver later on in terms of reducing conflicts and increasing communications. If that's done early, there's other things you can work on. You have these people, and it's okay to have, and good idea to have breakout rooms where folks can go off and work on a threat that's come up or something like that. And then that's going to be a busy day and a hard day. So at the end of that day, have the team do some kind of fun event, whether it's a dinner or attending a sporting event. Hopefully you've planned something like that, and it's talked about in the book. It's very good to have a chance for the team to get to know each other. And if you go back to our cultural thing, being in Southern Europe or close to Southern Europe, you guys get that probably better than most Americans. Next slide. Day two, winding down. You've got the schedule, you've got the WBS, and now you're adding the elements of duration and dependencies to that. You as a facilitator, you're walking around and visiting the different functional groups to make sure that you've captured the activities. You understand why they've said this depends on this, or this is 7 weeks and why isn't it 3? A great expression here, good is better than perfect. You're not looking for perfection. You want to record the main ideas and get that in place. At this point in day two, you can start working on the risk register and a responsible assignable consult inform RACI matrix. You not only know who's doing what, but you also have a list of risks. And again, that means both threats and opportunities. Those experts in the room who are most capable, you have them work on prioritizing those risks by the usual probability and impact. And I love this, and it's perfectly appropriate for Italy. Remember, Rome wasn't built in a day. Great expression. There's an internet meme here. Romans after the first day, we're barely going. So.
And we had this in here before we even planned to do this Italy one, so it's just
right.
a coincidence.
That's right. We had 2 references to Italy without even knowing we were going to do an Italian presentation. When in Rome. Okay, go ahead.
Right. The virtual one.
Yes. So sorry, I had to see. This is the things that can happen. I have a computer update that just started on my computer, but I'm okay. When you're running a meeting that's a combination of in-person and virtual, there's a great book here. Wayne Termel, fantastic author, wrote a book called The Long Distance Leader, and we let Wayne actually write one of our chapters. He's so prolific in this area, and he did it quite willingly. These are some of the tips from him. See each other. Make sure you can see each other. Now, we haven't done that here, partially because of the international aspect and the aversion to risk and the bandwidth involved. But if it's possible, which these days it often is, You want to allow people, at least at the beginning, to see each other. We crave a visual connection. In a webinar situation, we tend to mute the audience, but in a meeting, you want to allow, once the ground rules about no cats meowing and toilets flushing are set, you want to be able to hear each other instantly, and that allows for that instant feedback, and it's more similar to an in-person meeting. Check in with, if you've got someone connected only by phone, check in with them, don't isolate them. Check in with them every 10 minutes. Hey, we haven't heard from you. Any comments on the risk response plan? Use chat proactively as an instructor. What I found is that especially my Chinese students are very active on chat because accent is not a problem. So they're very unshy when it comes to a class where I'm interacting with them via chat, whereas in a classroom, I'll see often a lot of blank faces when I ask for feedback because they're a little bit shy about speaking up because of the accent. This is something just practical that I've noticed. So use chat, use whiteboards and screen sharing. The capability is there. Take advantage of it. That's the preaching that we hear from Wayne. Take advantage of the capability. Don't just use the webinar, the meeting functions as a telephone. There are things like polls and other things you can do. Take advantage of those. And there's nothing wrong with homework. In this case, uploading some files in advance, making sure that instead of having to scurry around and find things, those files are already present in the structure of the GoToMeeting or whatever system you're using.
Next.
Yep, next slide. Sorry.
Okay.
So this is not just about that big planning meeting. A lot of the things we talk about apply everywhere, and just your regular weekly or biweekly status meetings can stand to be improved, I bet. Don't take them for granted. You need them, and they should not be just, okay, it's time to meet again. Again, you need to bring in a little bit of excitement, and here's what we're at, and here's why it's important for you to attend. But have in advance the ideas of how often this is. Should you have an agenda? Yes, yes, and yes. Even for a status meeting, you want to have an agenda, maybe even an idea of who's speaking when about what topic. Make sure you're getting attendance. If not, find out why not. Same kinds of principles apply. Manage the meeting, keep time, keep minute meetings, make sure action items are recorded and publicized, highlighted, communicated. If someone's got something to do, make sure that they're called on it. And use the time in the status meeting to review the schedule and risk register. Risk should be risk is alive. It's the way I like to express it. It should be a part of at least every other status meeting, if not every status meeting. Next, you're back.
I'm back up. Okay, lessons learned meetings. And in fact, same questions we ask in our sprint retrospective and agile retrospective. Lessons learned meetings, I can't emphasize the importance of these when I teach and when I consult. Very few people, they don't run them, or they do run them and they don't use them, or they do run them, use them, but don't follow up with anybody. So you have to have a lessons learned meeting after the phase or close of the project. Keep it brief. You ask for pre-meeting input. Make sure it's not finger pointing. Oh, operations didn't do what engineering wanted to do, or vice versa. Work the issue, not the person. Have a third party come in if it can't be neutral. Have a neutral, like the PMO can come in, or a consultant come in and run it for you. What went well, what didn't, what can we do differently? But here's an important point. I gave this recently at another PMI chapter here near the Boston area about a month or so ago, and the guy said, I'm not making this up. He says, nobody does anything at the lessons learned meetings. I said, what do you do? He said, we take meeting minutes and then we store them on the server. I said, do you have action items and follow-up? He said, no. I said, well, nothing's going to happen. It's not going to run itself. So hold a lessons learned meeting, get action items, have dates when those action items be followed up, and follow up on them. It's your job if you're the project manager. So do have these because they will help you get better, they help you improve. We have them within Waterfall, I don't want to say randomly, but at the end of phases of projects. They have every 2 weeks in Agile, so they learn quicker. What about Agile? The reason that we mention Agile at all is for this, not only because it's a popular thing these days, But also, and this is not an introduction to Agile, so you may know something about it, you may not. But Agile is a different beast. They don't use terms like project manager, does not exist, or Gantt chart, it does not exist. But what I did want to tell you, what Rich and I did want to tell you, is that the Agile people also have a 2-day meeting. There's a framework. There are several scaled frameworks, Scrum to Scale, Scaled Agile framework, and they are large frameworks for multiple Scrums that are working together, and they have these planning meetings. And you can see, you can't see, sort of on the right-hand side there, you can see different sprints, different groups, and how they're linked together. So where Rich and I have been talking about a 2-day meeting for Waterfall for planning these big projects, well, guess what? The Agilists have the same thing. They have a 2-day meeting. They have a program increment. I won't get into all the details. They have a person called a release train engineer, which you could probably think of as analogous to a program manager. There's a lot of analogies on both sides. So we just wanted to point out that while Agile is planning a different way, they're always planning, whereas we do a lot of upfront planning. They also have a planning meeting that lasts a couple of days and brings all the Agile and Scrum teams together. So there is an analogy to that. We wanted to sort of mention that to you for folks that may either be doing Agile or planning to do Agile. And I find that just the one last piece on that, Agile's been around now, viable for 15 or 20 years. There are many people doing it whilst a lot of other people are talking about it or thinking about it. It is a very viable thing. Key points. We're getting near the end here. Summary of key points. Planning cannot be avoided. We mentioned it before. We'll mention it again. If you do not do prior to the project, you have to stop and do it during execution. Somewhere you have to plan. So you might as well do it prior. One of the problems you have, and Rich and I have seen this, is, and this is not kidding around, the management might say, you don't appear to be doing anything. Well, yeah, planning. We're getting in a room. We're figuring out how we're going to do it. I mean, if you asked me to put a rocket ship into space, I wouldn't just put it up there and worry about it later. There's a lot of planning that is involved in it. Rich was involved in planning one of the Olympics, so there's a lot that goes into it. Involve stakeholders early and often. Rich mentioned that they need to be very engaged because they're the people for whom you're doing it. You want to keep them on your side. Action items without due dates are meaningless. If you say, yeah, I'll do that, I'm going to say, or should say, when are you going to do it by? And then follow up with you. And I'm not worried about whether I'm bugging you or not, because that's my job as a project manager, is to follow up with you to see if that's done. And I find, truthfully, a lot of people, if they're mature in an organization, they want you to follow up with them. They don't have time for everything, so it's your job to do that. Make sure the purpose of the meeting is understood. Always have an agenda. Can't read this super well, but it's a picture of meeting called by, facilitator. This is a lot of the elements we're looking at. Timekeeper, attendees, please read, please bring. What's the type of meeting? What's the agenda item? Who's the presenter? And as Rich talked about, in the best meetings, especially those that are more than a half a day, you have time brackets when people can, in which they can speak. And then you know that if they're going to go over, you have a decision to make. A person has 15 minutes, and all of a sudden everybody says, this is a super important point. Oh, what are we going to sacrifice to discuss that super important point? We're going to change the agenda. This is not an open-ended thing. We have to reach some goals. And by the way, if you have these day-long meetings or half-day meetings or 2-day meetings, and you don't reach all your goals, but you really tried, it may be because surprises did come up. Sometimes they're hard to miss or hard to get around. Rich, you want to take the second one?
Yes. So part of being large and in charge, don't lose your composure. If someone goes hot, you go cool, right? The best thing you can do is not to try to match their emotion, but if someone is angry, you want to get that cooled down, perhaps take it offline and assure them that we'll work on this pairwise, meaning one-on-one. Outside of the entire meeting, you usually have a lot of people involved and don't need to take everyone's time with what starts as a battle and could just be a simple misunderstanding. Preparation, right? Half the battle, and you're going to bring the energy level up and get the meeting done in less time and have a much more meaningful outcome if you prepare for it. And that includes, by the way, one thing we mentioned, but I want to underline, is homework. I know I mentioned it once, but what I mean by that is it's okay to challenge people, maybe that's a good way to put it, to come to the meeting with something. something that maybe it's a quick bullet list of your your top 5 points. It doesn't have to be a thesis paper. But having them responsible for coming to the meeting with something is okay, especially once they see that it makes the meeting go so much more smoothly. The team is looking to you for leadership, and that might include some sternness when it comes to keeping the meeting on time. Always have the meeting goal in mind, which should, of course, link to the project's goal. Sometimes having an image of the final project's product bridge, screenshot of an app up on the board, not a bad idea. I like this next one, and I want to stress this, especially with different cultures. Make sure shy and introverted people have a role and a say. The way you do that is to build a safe space. Maybe acknowledge, look, I know that everyone doesn't have English as a first language here. Please feel free to see, I stumbled. Feel free to speak up. If there's a problem with understanding what you're saying in English is a problem, we'll just have someone translate, or we'll have you repeat it.
Or Italian for that matter.
Or what?
Or Italian for that matter.
Or right. Or if you're in a meeting where Italian is the main language and you have Chinese members and they're shy about speaking up, assure them that it's okay to speak up, and either have a translator or have someone just acknowledge the fact that we might not understand you the first time, and it's okay if we ask you to repeat. And that's part of being socially and culturally aware. When you're done, publish the meeting minutes. The meeting shouldn't just be a call in an echo in an echo canyon. Hello, hello, hello. It should be, you expect to hear something back. So I've attended this meeting. I contributed my two lira. €2, and when I'm done, I want to see, how did that take? How did it get recorded into the minutes? And if you're not willing to follow up and really press people, don't have the meeting. The whole idea of having the meeting is to get something done, like creating the schedule. And if you're not going to get good information for that schedule, your schedule won't be accurate. Your bridge won't meet in the middle of the river, and you'll have all kinds of problems. Next slide. This is just a nice graphic. I actually suggest printing it out and having it on your desk before you run a meeting. It's got kind of the key ground rules for what an effective meeting looks like, and it's just a nice idea. The other thing we talk about in the book is to have icebreakers at the beginning of a meeting where folks do not know each other. There are all kinds of them. We've got a list here through the link, scienceofpeople.com. One of the ones I use at the university level is human bingo. This is something where we really like to do, and I'll just leave it as a tease here, but it is something where you get everyone involved. People make connections one-on-one and try to fill in a bingo sheet based on interests and places they visited and so forth. Too much to explain here, but it's really kind of a fun and very active icebreaker exercise.
And Rich, I'll move us along just for being timekeeper and being
excellent.
large and in charge. Well, we're just about there. So if you don't mind, I'll do the learning points. These are the same ones we had up front. We are self-congratulating ourselves, Rich and I, that we actually accomplished this. But
nice job, Jim.
Yeah, understand why planning for your project is so important. We hope we at least conveyed some essence of that. How to prepare for and facilitate. Well, we talked about it. You have a lot more to learn if you've never facilitated one. I get that. Understand the impacts of culture. They're very important. And Rich was saying we're kidding around with the slide but that's actually a very serious book that Richard Lewis wrote. He's the kind of guy that you go to that says, if I'm going to go to, say, Arabia for 6 months, what's my behavior supposed to be? So he's the kind of guy you go to for that, and his book is very good for that. So I have no stake in that book. I just thought it was a very good book and had a lot of good ideas. But there we are. I think that's pretty much it. I wanted to say one other thing too. That Rich mentioned, and I'll turn the floor to questions, the whole energy thing. Rich and I teach a lot, as I mentioned, so we are very cognizant in teaching a 3 or 4 day class where the information is very dry, like project management, and keeping it alive and interesting. And when you see people, their eyes are glazed over, getting tired, yes, it's time for a coffee break or introduce an exercise or something. So you have to be very attuned because people will just talk to each other. and tune you out. So be very aware of that. So there we are.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much to Rich and Jim. Your presentation is really interesting, and the confirmation of this is that we have already some questions without push the audience to make questions. And first of all, we have a question from Luca. He asks if body language is difficult in a virtual meeting, and which tips can we have there?
Well, the obvious ones I'll start with are the folded arms. You all know that a person folds their arms in front of you, and that means they're resistant to you, or they give you what we call the cold shoulder. They turn their back to you. Those are the two. Now, Rich might have some others. Those are the two that come to mind that tell me a person is resisting. Also, nodding or shaking their head. People do things involuntarily. So if they're nodding and smiling, they're understanding and liking. Otherwise, yeah, if somebody's shaking their head, folding their arms and turning their back to you, you don't need to call them out directly. But I would get to them the side of the break and say, hey, how's this going for you? And then they might open up a little bit. Those are the most obvious, less subtle ones, I think, that I see.
Yeah. Let me just add, there's something called position rapport. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but you can test this at your next meeting. You might want to just lean your head on your arm. I can't show you, but you get the idea. Put your chin, rest your chin / cheek in the palm of your hand, and see if people around the room are emulating that. This is more as an attendee to attendee thing. See if people are emulating that body language. Those who involuntarily, as Jim said, start to do that are the ones who are most kind of in line with what you're thinking, what you're saying, and they're clearly paying attention. It's surprising and kind of funny when you do this. You just change your body language a little bit, your body language, and see if people are emulating it. But I would underline what Jim said, and that is a closed body language. Crossed arms, crossed legs means one of two things. they are paying attention, or they actually need to use the restroom really quickly.
Yeah, exactly.
But also just of their approach to the table. Are they right up against the table? Are they leaning in? I mean, a lot of it is obvious, and a lot of this does not come through necessarily in a virtual meeting unless you do have the really good video capability. Good question.
Yes, correct. Yes, in particular for Italians, it's important. You know that we move a lot of our hand and
gestures are important.
Yes, we have so many questions that I'm sorry, but we are not able to ask all the questions.
We can follow up with some. of them.
Yes. All the questions we record and probably will be answered in next. In the following moments. By the way, there is a nice question from Francesco. He asks how to deal with the questions during presentation. No, sorry, there is a double. Okay, how to deal with the topic addressed in the pre-meeting calls if there are not in agenda. Do we have to address them in the meeting or not? I think in the general.
Okay. Is the question because one does not have an agenda at all, or one does not have an agenda yet?
Okay, perfect, nice.
That's the question I'm asking.
Yeah, Jim's trying to clarify the question.
Yeah, is it because you don't have an agenda yet, or you never get to an agenda? It depends on the answer to that question. Is what I'm looking for, that clarification.
If they are not in the agenda.
But they plan to. So, well, they should. It's because the problem is, I mean, you certainly are going to deal with questions as they come up, and you're not going to chastise somebody, but this is what all the upfront preparation is about, making sure those questions are answered. So I think, and Rich can maybe back me up on this or not, something we should even add to the bullets is anticipate questions. So if I'm the facilitator and I don't get those questions up front and I don't have the agenda ready, I'm going to. Rich and I, if we're going to co-facilitate, might anticipate questions. Oh, I thought you might ask that question and here's the answer. But there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't have the answer for you. See, this is the problem sometimes. We think we have to have the answer to everything. As experienced trainers, Rich and I know that if we know mostly everything, if somebody asks a question, there's nothing wrong with saying, I have to get back to you. I would rather spend time exploring it than trying to be the genius that knows the answer to everything. That doesn't work.
Yes, I think you answer really well, because it's really, really interesting tips, this, and I'm really satisfied about your answer. So I think also Francesco is satisfied. We have so many questions. Actually, by the way, we have to end the webinar because it's time to go.
Sorry to hear that.
By the
Have
way,
fun.
I will thank you, because I want to underline that Rich and Jim are actually on holiday, because in the USA it's a national holiday. So thank you to all. Thank you to all of the audience. They have all the questions that we answer in another moment. And I will still, like I say, some PowerPoint slide from you to keep on my desk for organize next meeting. And I remember to everyone that will be a survey that automatically you will find it in the email, and that this is our first in language, in English language webinar, and we would like to propose other of these, because we saw that many people are with us. Okay, thank you, Rich. Thank you, Jim, from by PMI, and hope to see you soon.
Yes,
Okay,
yes,
you.
hope to see you soon.
Okay, bye.
Okay, thank you. Ciao.
Ciao, ciao, bye.